This week's film is one that wasn't initially on my list. So it was spring 2017 when I first was putting together a rough 100 movies to discuss for this project, and that's kind of been tweaked, obviously, as I've gone through, but this is one that, Logan, you and I were just kind of talking about a couple weeks before recording this, and it was kind of the perfect film that fit this nice little spot in the timeline that I'm kind of surprised I hadn't included when I made the initial list. So
right, and I was kind of surprised that I didn't think of it sooner either, because it's a movie about it's like a 2-for-1. It's about a specific historical person and also about a specific historical event.
Correct. And yes, and you can talk about them independently. So it's not like Ip Man is super influential within the Second Sino-Japanese War or even World War II, but he is a historical figure who is worth talking about, and then the movie is set during a specific historical event.
Right.
So yes, what does it say? So it says it opens again, I'm going to apologize up front once and for all our mispronunciations of everything within this film. But
so it starts off in Foshan.
Foshan. I was going to say Foshan. Okay, yeah. In 1935.
Right. We see Ip Man, which that's also probably a mispronunciation, but that's how it's written. So that's how I'm going to say it. Who was he was a master of Wing Chun Kung Fu in Foshan is in like southeastern China. It's also, I guess, the province that it's in is also called Canton,
right,
which is where you get like Cantonese, which is why they speak Cantonese in Hong Kong, and then they speak Mandarin in the rest of the country. Yeah, so we start in Foshan, and then eventually after the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, he's forced to move to Hong Kong. That's where he actually gets famous and world renowned, is for his martial arts, his Kung Fu Academy in Hong Kong, which he's taught both directly and then obviously indirectly as Wing Chun has spread as a discipline millions of people since the 30s. Most notably, he trained Bruce Lee in Kung Fu from the time Bruce Lee was like a little kid, which they kind of go into that more in the sequels. But at the end of this movie, it does say, he teaches all these people, and Bruce Lee was one of his students.
Yes. Oh, and so plot-wise, and we can kind of bounce around, but this movie, more than any other, I think, on this entire project, can be summed up in probably the fewest amount of words, because basically the story is Ip Man is the best at Kung Fu in Foshan. When the Japanese invade Foshan, their general wants to fight him. The end.
Right, pretty much. And it's also not really meant to be a historical drama as much as it is a Kung Fu movie.
But a really good one. Like, that sounds like it's easy to dismiss, and it is not. It's a really good movie.
No, it's the fight scenes, like the Kung Fu sequences, the fight choreography it's awesome. It's so good.
And even the characterization holds up. Like, it's not even just like it's a bunch of cool fights. I mean, the fights are awesome, but you like the characters, right, and their relationships are important, and what triggers some fights, and sometimes he doesn't want to fight, and then, of course, the Japanese invasion. And no, it's a really, really good movie.
Right, and the drama is really powerful too. You really see the effect that the Japanese invasion has on your everyman. So like there's a point where he has to go beg for work. He used to basically live in this mansion. He was like a pretty high class guy in Foshan, and then after the Japanese invade, they take his mansion and they turn it into their headquarters, and then he's forced to kind of try and scrape by a living for him and his family. And that's another thing, the dynamic that you see between him and his wife not really liking Kung Fu at the beginning of the movie, because she thinks, and rightly so, that he doesn't spend enough time with his kid, that he's too worried about Kung Fu. And then you see how their family dynamic evolves.
Yes, and how fighting becomes kind of important for not just his pride, but obviously his pocketbook. And I was always kind of confused at the beginning, where he's just like, what does he do? He just lives in a mansion? And yeah, kind of. He was from just kind of an upper class family and didn't seem to really have to do much work-wise, and was just kind of I don't know, he was just wealthy and didn't really have to worry about it looked like, and had kind of studied Kung Fu. Now, and not not as young as you would think. Like, as good as he is and was in real life, going through his Wikipedia page, it's like, oh, okay, well, he kind of studied for this person when he was like 12 for a couple years, and then someone else a few years later. Like, the whole years of dedication to a craft to be this good. I don't know. I always think like Tiger Woods golfing since he's 3, or athletes just start so young to be these skilled specialists. He didn't start as young as I thought, and didn't seem to have. I mean, yes, he definitely had obsessive practice for years on end, but I guess, or you think about the whole 10,000 hour rule, it's like, did he even hit 10,000 hours before the time he was 30 with this stuff?
Yeah, I don't know. He started learning Wing Chun Kung Fu when he was 12 years old.
Right.
So pretty young, but not nearly as young as, like, for instance, Bruce Lee is.
Okay.
When Bruce Lee first started training under him, he was, I don't know his exact age, but he was like a little kid.
Okay. And I guess the idea too, just because he wasn't having formal training doesn't mean he wasn't like practicing like we see him by himself, all the time. So he was aware of it and obviously then kind of developed it more himself. But yeah, so the movie, like you already mentioned, isn't super historical, because if I was reading it right, he didn't even seem to have stayed in Foshan during the Japanese occupation. He had already moved to Hong Kong, and the movie kind of keeps him in Foshan just to be part of the drama and occupation there. Is that what you saw as well?
Yeah. I think in real life he moved to Hong Kong a little sooner.
Right.
Obviously, a lot of the stuff where the Japanese general wants to have the kung fu masters fight his Japanese soldiers, that's all fictionalized,
right?
Or at least heavily dramatized for the movie. Like the scene where Ip Man fights 10 Japanese soldiers at once. Yeah, which is, man, one of the coolest fight scenes of all time, though. Like,
it is really good. And so, in my thought, when you see stuff like that in the past, your thought is always like, why don't they all just rush him at once? And this is kind of the first time I kind of thought, oh, I kind of get it, because we all just rush in at once. We're just going to hit each other. So we can kind of maybe try to get him a couple at a time, maybe even 3 guys at a time, but everyone else just needs to be ready to pounce as soon as there's a window from him beating the other guy. It actually wouldn't make sense for 10 guys to pounce on him at once, because he would just hit each other and make a pile.
Right, and you see like there are times where he's not just fighting one at a time. Like there's times where he's fighting, like he's literally fighting 4 guys at once. He's like punching 2 dudes, one with each hand, and kicking 2 dudes.
Yes. And I guess we really didn't get, it would be a good opportunity to get in the history of martial arts itself, but I hadn't really researched any of that. But obviously it just means any kind of warfare. And what we kind of tend to see martial arts as weaponless, but martial just kind of means war. So, I mean, even archery would be a martial art.
Right, archery, fencing is a martial art.
Right. Anything to deal with battle skills, I guess. But
yeah, this speaking of the martial arts, this movie has some. I particularly liked the wire fu and how restrained it was. So it's not like the Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Where
is that what that's called? Okay, I hadn't thought about that. Where you kind of defy gravity. Yeah.
I don't know if that's the actual technical name for it, but that's kind of what it's known as. But yeah, so it's in this movie they use it to like it's just a little bit outside the realm of possibility, like how far people fly when you kick them, or
how high I'm jumping. Yeah.
Flip over back. Right. Yeah.
You're right. It's pretty subtle. It's almost realistic. Whereas Crouching Tiger, it gets to where it's like I'm going to just jump to this roof real quick and then float across the treetops. Like it kind of takes it a little farther. But yeah, here it's subtle to the point that it almost doesn't even exist.
Right.
Oh, so I was going to talk about, and not that I just kind of what I briefly read on, how did you say it? Wing Chun in general? Wing Chun in general?
Wing Chun, yeah.
So as far as a martial art goes, so there's obviously different types. We think of these Chinese, Japanese martial arts, and they're definitely in different categories. Basically some are based on, fist or hand striking. Some are based on defense. Some are based on kicking. Something like judo is based on throwing. And they're all kind of just, different shades. And they all kind of, overlap in a lot of ways too. But what I was reading on Wing Chun is it's even called, the word is like soft. But then like Ip Man himself said, don't let that fool you. It still can be aggressive and it is still very forceful. But the idea of soft in that the movements are very fluid. And at least the way we see it in the film, it does seem like it is very defense oriented, but then I'm immediately going, once you kind of expose yourself to have some kind of opening for me, I'm going to then take advantage and destroy you once I've kind of basically I've defended off your attacks, and now I'm on the offensive once you've made a mistake and I'm just ending you.
Right. Softness as in you remain supple, kind of relaxed relaxed and loose, which you can see when he's doing, practicing with the wooden post.
Yes.
And it's just kind of showing him, how he flows from one position to the next.
Yes, it makes it look effortless. And man, and I just occurred to me, because I was going to say, like, oh, we'll compare it to like how it looks in Bruce Lee movies. I don't think I've ever seen a Bruce Lee movie. Is that the worst thing ever to admit on this episode?
like not even a single one?
No.
Not even the
Enter the Dragon or whatever, like.
Yeah, you've never even seen Enter the Dragon?
No. I mean, I've seen some clips of Bruce Lee, obviously, but like,
right.
I don't think I've actually seen any of his movies. And to the point that I didn't even know until watching Once Upon a Time in Hollywood what he kind of sounded like. I mean, obviously it's not really him, but they portray him in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And I'm like, oh, that's what Bruce Lee sounded like? And then after the fact saw an interview with him just to kind of confirm. It's like, oh yeah, that's what he sounds like. Just in the sense that he's a very, very American sounding guy. And I don't know enough about where he is from, but I figured if he trained with Ip Man, he was like from Hong Kong, right?
He was born in California, and then he moved there. So he's actually born in San Francisco.
Okay. That's why sounds very American. And his name Bruce, I guess.
Yeah. Interesting trivia about Enter the Dragon. Not that this is really applicable to this movie. I don't want to get too far off the rails, but Jackie Chan is actually in that movie. Is one of his first roles. He's an extra.
Yeah. So actually, yeah. So it had a list of all the people who used this Wing Chun fighting style. So Ip Man, Bruce Lee, Bruce's son Brandon, but then also, one, Donnie Yen, who plays Ip Man in this movie,
yes,
and Jackie Chan. So it's all considered to be, they're all under that Wing Chun branch of Kung Fu.
Right. Which, let me just take this opportunity, since we brought up Donnie Yen, to just espouse my love for Donnie Yen.
He's awesome. He's a great actor. Yeah.
Oh, he's so good. I like all of his fight choreography is awesome. He's done a bunch. So I think the first time I saw him was in Hero.
Oh, is he the third of the main three or whatever?
I don't remember which. He's he's got long hair. They got the spears.
Yeah, but it's like there's the trio, because it's Jet Li, the girl, and the other guy, right? Or am I getting confused? I've seen Hero like 3 or 4 times, but I guess I'm getting confused. Is he just the other guy?
I haven't seen Hero in a minute. I just remember that they have I think he might even be the one. Is he the guy that he fights, like they fight in their minds? They're just sitting there imagining how. Well,
that happens too.
Anyway.
Oh, yeah, okay. No, so he is a smaller role. So, no, the third guy with Jet Li and the girl is my actual favorite non-English speaking actor, Tony Leung.
Oh, okay.
But Donnie Yen is also in it, and
right.
I actually kind of forget how he works into it then, I guess. But
right, I don't remember how he fits into the story, but I remember that the scene with him and Jet Li fighting with a spear. And but yeah, and he's gotten a lot more kind of like blockbustery Hollywood roles recently. He was in Rogue One. I believe he was in the Green Hornet remake with Seth Rogen that they made a few years ago.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, and then what's the name of the movie? Legend of the Fist,
which I've not seen but have heard of.
Yes, it's really good, starring Donnie Yen. Anyways. But he also does, he doesn't just act, he also does a lot of fight choreography, even for movies that he's not in.
Oh, okay.
So he did fight choreography for I think one of the Blade movies or something.
Oh, interesting. And so yeah, Ip Man does have a series of sequels. I've only seen the first one, but all of them are fairly highly rated, at least the first few. And number 2 actually has a higher rating than the first one on Rotten Tomatoes, I believe.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And let's get into I think we're probably good on Ip Man. Let's get into the Chinese-Japanese history side of this conflict.
Oh, right. In the movie, there's a text comes on the screen, and it doesn't explain it, but it mentions, it says, 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident happens, and then now China is at war with Japan, which I guess the Marco Polo Bridge incident is a battle that was fought at the Marco Polo Bridge between the National Revolutionary Army of China and the Imperial Japanese Army. And it's actually, a lot of people point to that as the beginning of World War II.
which I thought was, and that was what I was going to mention as well. And I thought that's kind of interesting, almost to the point that, is it just our Western centrism that is the only reason that is not considered the beginning of World War II?
So I think that probably plays into it, because a lot of people say, oh no, it was, September 1939, Adolf Hitler messing around in Europe. But I think another reason is because this conflict was more directly between China and Japan. It wasn't
true.
I don't know. It wasn't like a bid by Japan to try and take over the world as much as it was, a Chinese and Japan centric conflict that kind of got folded into the Pacific theater.
So that's probably fair. It is the beginning. Yes, this incident in July of 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident that kind of escalated into a fight and war between China and Japan, is the beginning of the fighting that continued into and was part of World War II, which is why you could say it's the start of World War II. But to your point, it is not the beginning of the aggression that triggered the larger World War II in France. So it wasn't a trigger to the larger conflict, but it was the beginning of the fighting within the larger conflict as it evolved over the next 8 years. Is that probably the way to say it?
Yes.
And then obviously didn't end because I was watching a video on this to kind of just get it all into my mind as well. And so July 1937, beginning of the conflict. And the end of the conflict was basically triggered by the Americans dropping the bomb, and the Japanese were still fighting China, and it was a very kind of back and forth. It wasn't trench warfare, but it was a very kind of just unproductive battle on both sides. The Japanese were winning early, but then the Chinese are able to kind of hold them into a standstill, and of course then are getting Russian and American help throughout that kind of helps keep the Japanese at bay. But the Japanese were still kind of being aggressors here until the U.S. got to submit, and they kind of stopped the Chinese conflict at the same time they stopped the conflict with the U.S. and Pacific theater ended in general. Right.
And when talking about this conflict, a lot of the focus, in talking about World War II, a lot of the focus is on the atrocities of the Nazis, and rightly so. Obviously, they perpetrated the Holocaust, which was just horrible, but there are also a lot of time it's kind of overlooked, or at least a lot less widely known, the Japanese atrocities against Chinese civilians,
yes,
especially during like the early part of the war, and also the Pacific theater as a whole. I mean, we hear a lot about like the island hopping campaigns and the amphibious landings, like in Iwo Jima and Guadalcanal and Okinawa, but that's really only half of the Pacific theater. That was kind of that's the eastern part of the Pacific theater of World War II. Then you also had the CBI, or the China-Burma-India campaign, which is fought kind of against the western side of the Japanese empire in places like China and Burma and India.
So, for example, yes, the movie gives the date October 1938 for when the Japanese army finally moved into Foshan, and talked about them destroying factories. And it says the population of Foshan went from 300,000 to 70,000. And I kind of initially thought naively that was largely because of people fleeing. But I think a depressing amount of that is due to just slaughtering civilians. And yes, they were basically not concerned. The video I just watched today was talking about how the Japanese were getting frustrated. So, I'll backtrack here in a second. But the Japanese were getting frustrated with their struggles against China and basically started slaughtering civilians out of anger and frustration at not being able to make better headway into China. Now, what's also worth mentioning is before the 1937 Marco Polo Bridge incident that started this war with China in earnest, Japan in the early 1930s, 1930, 1931, had invaded and taken over Manchuria and basically had been occupying it for the previous, 6 or 7 years. And that wasn't considered part of this war, basically because once they'd conquered Manchuria, no one was fighting anymore. It was just, yep, Japan now owns Manchuria. And so it wasn't considered part of this conflict. Although, again, you look on the Wikipedia page, it did mention another alternative start date for World War II would be that invasion of Manchuria, if you wanted to tie everything together even further. So just going to the Japanese side in general, so a lot of their aggression stemmed from a hyper nationalism, and that over the course of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, Japan, having a long centuries history of this warrior culture with, the samurais and just a very proud people, became just super, super proud of who they were, and were very elitist about, like, we're basically the best people on the world, and we're going to start to prove it, and we're ready to start conquering stuff. And so they started spreading out from their island, where they'd basically kind of been isolationist, and just in their arrogance and strength, and of course, what the video I watched today did not mention, but we kind of touched on with Battleship Potemkin, after beating Russia, they were just a little more confident now too, and we're now a world player, and they're starting to flex their muscle in the early 20th century leading into World War II here. Yeah, so yeah, we're seeing the beginnings of all that in our timeline here, as we're in the late 1930s, and we're basically right on the cusp, or again, as we've already said, into the beginnings of what will become World War II here.
I mentioned the China, Burma, India campaign, and just one of the interesting little facets of that theater of World War II is a unit, a fighter pilot unit called the 1st American Volunteer Group. And it's interesting because they were all pilots that were, Americans from the Army Air Corps and the Navy and the Marines, but they officially fell under the Chinese Air Force, and they flew fighter planes, P-40s, but instead of having how an American plane has the star in the circle with the little bars on the side.
Yeah.
They have these P-40s. They were so an American warplane, but instead of the American star in the circle, it's the sun in the blue circle, the white sun in the blue circle, like you see in the flag for the Republic of China or for Taiwan.
Huh. Okay, so yeah, we're at that point in world history where we are ready to now tackle World War II. And looking at our schedule here, we're going to spend basically the entire month of February here, and actually even a couple episodes into March, talking about World War II. Logan and I have kind of joked that we could probably spend a whole 100 movies on just World War II. And we're going to give you about 5 or 6 here and spend a few weeks getting into World War II. And it's going to start next week with the classic movie Casablanca, starring Humphrey Bogart.
Oh, I can't wait.